Sector Report is proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.
Welcome to Tower Sector Report. I'm David Beatson, and this week, food fraud, the price of eggs, and our changeable climate. New Zealand forensic scientists are joining the battle to make sure you're eating just what you think you are. What's at stake in the push to keep hens out of colony cages? And where's the wild, wild weather coming from, along with what you think about climate change? Well, next month, forensic experts, food scientists, producers and regulators are holding a special conference in Wellington. They'll be focusing on the safety of New Zealand food, both here and overseas, in the face of a growing problem involving food fraud, contamination and adulteration on a massive scale. It's a global battle, and a Dunedin-based company has been building a global reputation as a pioneer in the science of verifying the origin of commercial foods. Our Rural Affairs correspondent, Drew Chappell, has been checking out the checker.
For most of us, the biggest food safety concerns are nothing more than checking the expiry dates on our milk or eggs. Why should Kiwis worry about safe food? After all, we produce plenty of it, and we're cleaner and greener than anyone else on Earth. One Dunedin-based company, though, is making a business out of answering two questions it seems the rest of the world is asking about food. Where does it come from, and how did it get from there to here?
You only need to look at the popularity of farmers markets, where more and more people are going to farmers markets, and what's driving that and what's driving the local food movement is obviously part of that is philosophical, but part of it is if you go and front up to the person who's producing the food, then there is a responsibility for that person to produce good food or safe food, and you can go and see them the following week and say, you know, I got sick from what you gave me. And so, you know, I think that consumers are getting more and more aware.
Professor Helen Darling is the CEO of Oratane Global, a company which has quickly become a world leader in commercial food certification. That means the company can trace a piece of food or organic material back to where it came from by studying its genetic properties or isotopes. Their science team profiles the chemical trace elements and can match these up to a food-growing region anywhere in the world. Dr. Darling says it's not currently something that New Zealanders are too aware of, but they will be soon.
To a certain extent, I think the food products produced in New Zealand are safe. New Zealand Food Standards Authority have done a very, very good job in terms of protecting consumers. On one hand, we do produce very good food in New Zealand. It's safe. We are increasingly exposed to product that we don't have control over. So I think that will be increasingly an issue for New Zealand. It certainly is in every other country, it seems. So I don't think we'll be immune to it.
Recently, Dr. Darling says there have been a couple of high-profile food scares involving New Zealand product overseas, causing some panic within the red meat industry in particular.
There was a case a few years ago where a product supposedly left New Zealand shores was tested in the European market and was found to be containing contaminant. Unfortunately, the laboratory worker had removed the packaging, had thrown out the label. Prior to the product being tested, they found it was contaminated, and the European authorities were very concerned about product from New Zealand at that time. It was a primary product, it was a meat product. It took 2 years for us to be able to prove that that sample hadn't come from where the European authorities thought it had. Where I'm getting to with that is, if you collect data proactively and work proactively, then the time to exoneration or the time to proving it's not yours would be hours. If you don't, then it can take up to 2 years, as was that case.
2 years of blocked trade to Europe would devastate our red meat industry, something which Oratane scientists say could happen given the right or wrong circumstances. Dr. Darling cites the example of the Australian honey industry, which was caught up in a scandal in 2001 when Singapore began producing large amounts of counterfeit product and selling it in China under false Aussie labels.
What was happening was honey from China was being transshipped to Singapore, which then went to Australia, was then sent into America, which was bad enough because it was circumventing trade barriers, or trade tariffs rather, but it was also contaminated with an antibiotic. Now, as a result, the Australian honey price has stayed very low. All other honey producing countries had a massive increase in value in 2001. Australia has never achieved that value, and their honey is now about the similar value per tonne to Chinese honey. So the damage to that industry has been long term, it has been irreparable almost.
Oratane is working with several New Zealand producers selling product overseas which simply can't afford to take risks, meaning if a similar thing happened here, they could quickly clear their name with the company's data.
There have been a few near misses that we've been really lucky with. We do know that there's an awful lot more honey, New Zealand honey, sold in the international market than we produce. Some people estimate it's up to 30% more. Now that's very difficult to quantify because you've got to catch all of the mislabelled and misrepresented honey to be able to prove how much. The most current example is the Australians' claim, and it was on Australian television last week, that New Zealand was using Chinese product in their mixed vegetables that were being sold in Australia. That's a really good case where the New Zealand industry is actually under threat, because public perception then becomes that New Zealand is a stopping point for ships from China, which we then repackage and say it's from New Zealand.
Dr. Jurien Ugewerf is Oratane's chief scientist and has relocated his family from the UK to New Zealand to help the team here speed up their work. He says the food frauds are currently ahead of the game, and there's no funding from governments anywhere for research into the issue.
At the moment, we're lagging behind the crooks actually. It's so easy to fake a label, to change it and to make it look original. And there haven't been really big government-funded programs to look at how big the scale is. My personal estimation is a kind of a social observation, looking at the newspapers and see how many criminals there are in the country. Might be 5 or 10%. And then maybe 5 or 10% of the food is adulterated. But we don't have any hard figures, so that's a big challenge actually to decide on policies for the future.
Dr. Ugewerf showed me that detecting frauds is not always as complicated as it seems.
Sometimes actually it's quite easy.
Yeah.
This is a nice example. Some people in Spain have asked us to look at their saffron. They're really worried about the saffron. It's a really nice product, people buy it all over the world, and it's very expensive, right? So here we've got some suspect saffron, and we think it might not be the original stuff. We're just going to see what's happened.
So that's just water?
That's just plain water,
yeah.
And actually, this time you can do this at home, right? This is the authentic saffron, which we have collected from Spain. This is about €5. Going in here, put it in. And here you see the difference already, very quickly.
Yeah, it's already starting to...
This is the counter. It shouldn't give this intense color within 2 or 3 minutes. It should take time, it should dissolve. But if you would give me an unknown sample, a bottle of water, I could give you regions of likelihood of the most likely place it would come from around the world, and probably, and that's the interesting thing, I could almost exclude 80 or 90% of where it couldn't come from. And a forensic scientist thinks that way. It's not necessarily to prove where something comes from, but if you can exclude so many others, then every technique will help you to narrow it down and actually limit your investigative work you have to do to sort out where it really came from. I think the most important problem for New Zealand at the moment, you have a nice New Zealand product. It's on the market, on the world market. It's been adulterated, has been replaced with an inferior product, and due to the logistics of New Zealand, probably not from New Zealand, the question, can we say this is New Zealand produce or not? That is actually quite easy at the moment.
And for exporters, our brand is our livelihood.
I was invited to speak at a food safety conference in China. And at Chicken in Auckland, the number of people who had boxes of baby food taking home safe baby food, because the perception is if it's got made in New Zealand on it, it's safe. Now, made in New Zealand, they're 4 words that anybody can easily type, and it's not hard to put them on a label. It doesn't matter what you put on it or how clever it only really causes a bit of a headache for the counterfeiters, and they're clever people. They can copy any label or any protection that we put onto something. But what we're talking about is what's actually in the product, and that can't be copied.
It's a situation which will surely affect our farmers and exporters in some way soon, whether more companies like Oratane are helping or not. The food fraud business seems to be moving much quicker than the organisations designed to stop them. But it would only take one high-profile incident to make people sit up and take notice, if they haven't already.
I guess it's an unfortunate reality of the world we live in that you can't trust anybody anymore.
Drew Chappell reporting. Free range, conventional cage or furnished colony cage? What's at stake in the battle over your breakfast egg? That's next on Tower Sector Report. Welcome back to Tower Sector Report. Well, last week, 3 groups of animal welfare advocates combined to turn up the heat in their campaign to end egg production from caged hens. We currently eat around 233 eggs per person per year in this country, and 83% of them come from farms with cage production systems, and the cage-produced egg sells at around half the price of a free-range egg. To date, the welfare lobbyists have succeeded in forcing a review of regulations by the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee. The caged egg producers have responded by trialling an improved furnished colony cage, but it's just a jump from one cage to another, according to the SPCA, the Green Party and SAFE, that's the Save Animals from Exploitation organisation. So what's at stake in the battle to keep the hens out of the colony cages? Joining me now, Mandy Carter, campaign manager for SAFE. Welcome, Mandy.
Hello.
Okay, what's the reason for escalating this campaign right now?
Well, as you already said, the code review process has been going on for the last few months, and a decision is expected next year. And 30,000 members of the public put in submissions saying they were against cage farming. And with the election coming up, it's very timely to remind David Carter.
The election coming up.
But it's perfect time to remind David Carter that the public do not want cages. And we've also been talking to other parties to see what they think. The Green Party have come out now and said they oppose battery cages and they want to see them banned. And it's SAFE and the SPCA have just signed up to an international position statement saying we oppose colony cages alongside the HSUS in the United States and also other worldwide organisations.
And right now we've got the eyes of the world to some degree focused on New Zealand with the Rugby World Cup. Has that figured into your thinking as well?
No, not really. I mean, it is more. It's a New Zealand issue. It's the New Zealanders that will make the decisions about it. And it's up to them to lobby. Talk to their MPs about it and say what they think of the issue.
Well, let me ask you this: why don't we wait for the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee to actually produce its final recommendation? They haven't got there yet.
Because in their draft recommendation, they've said that New Zealand could move to colony cages. And, we're saying that colony cages are little more than modified battery cages. They basically look like battery cages. They work the same way as battery cages. They have the same welfare problems as battery cages. Still, the hens have
They're bigger than battery cages.
Hens have no more space still than an A4 piece of paper. When we're talking about a piece of paper like this, how can that be right to keep an animal in that kind of conditions? If we kept a dog in cages that small, there'd be outrage about it. Why should it be okay for chickens?
Okay, but I come back to the point. Why not wait until you actually get a situation in which NAWAC, that organisation which is supposed to adjudicate on it, actually makes a recommendation?
Because now's the time for us to change their minds. If they're because the indications are they're intending to, invest a lot of money in colony cages. So, this is the time for the public to write to David Carter, write to your MPs, tell them what you want. You don't want colony cages. Recent polls have shown that 8 out of 10 New Zealanders are opposed to all cages. They think they're cruel. So, this is the time for us to take a stand and, make a difference before that. Before it's set in stone and it can't be changed.
Do you think that any form of caging would be acceptable at all?
No, it's not. It's, as I said, if it's not acceptable to keep companion animals in cages like cats and dogs, why is it okay to keep chickens in cages?
So from your perspective, it's all out.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop it now. Okay, but do you accept there would be a need to phase the change? You've got a very, very significant investment in the current production systems. You would have expanded land holdings required. You'd have a whole range of new consents that would have to be obtained under the Resource Management Act. You'd virtually bring the industry to a standstill if you said tomorrow, sorry, no more cage.
What the government is saying are that if cages were to be outlawed, it would be a 15-year phase out. SAFE thinks that's far too long. 5 years is plenty enough. You know, this we've been talking for 20 years about banning cages. You know, we don't need another 15 years to.
Have you got any idea how much it would cost us to actually make this change on a sort of medium-sized egg-producing property? Have you got any idea about that? I've seen figures that says operating costs would go up by 277 to 384,000 K a year.
For free
in
range.
that range just to convert, do the step they're talking now, let alone go to free range, which would be completely revolutionary from their perspective.
Yes, it is going to cost money, and you know what we'd say to farmers is don't be misled into thinking that colony cages are acceptable to the New Zealand public, because as I said, the polls are showing 8 out of 10 of us oppose cages.
We don't oppose it with our wallets. When it comes to the supermarket, 82% of the eggs bought in the supermarkets, 83% of them are actually caged hen product.
Well, that's funny, because also 82% of the public in our recent poll said to us that they prefer to buy free range. You know, and the
yeah, but it hasn't happened, has it? When push comes to shove, you've got free range eggs in the shop. You can pay more and have them and exercise your heart and your choice. But most people, when it comes to that, aren't doing it.
But I think it's perhaps because people don't realise quite the issues behind it. You know, and going back to colony cages, we don't want farmers to invest a hell of a lot of money in a cage system which will be banned here eventually too. In another 15 years.
Why do you say that?
Because it's already being outlawed all over the world.
Where's it been outlawed?
Austria and Germany have already banned colony cages. In Holland, no supermarket there sells any caged hen eggs. So we're talking about introducing a system which already other countries are moving away from. So in 15 years' time, when the code review it comes up again, if colony cages have been accepted, there could be strong indications that, again, farmers will be pressured to go to free range then. So they'll invest money now in it, and again then in another system altogether. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. It's start of the election campaign now. Is there an escalation?
We may be taking legal steps against colony cages because they are against the Animal Welfare Act. You know, the Animal Welfare Act of New Zealand does say that animals should be able to express their natural behaviour. They can't do that in a colony cage, so it's actually illegal.
More to come, obviously. Mandy Carter, thank you very much. Mandy Carter, Campaign Manager of SAFE. And coming up, what's driving the wild spring weather and how farmers feel about climate change. That's next on Tower Sector Report. Well, do you believe in climate change? And if you do, what should we be doing about it? One thing's for sure, New Zealand is certainly getting more than its share of extreme weather lately. Droughts, floods, scrub fires, snowstorms, thunderstorms, gales, even tornadoes. And we've seen some pretty massive weather switches year to year, season to season, even day to day. And last time we spoke to Country 99 TV's weather analyst Philip Duncan, he left promising to set up an online poll to see how people were feeling about that contentious issue of climate change. Well, he's back now with a progress report and some more insights into what's driving our wild, wild weather. Philip, welcome.
Hi.
Okay, so what does the Weather Watch poll say? Do we believe in climate change?
Well, it was fairly polarising, as most climate changes ones are. But it did show a significant amount of the farming community. We asked both the farming community and just the general public how they felt. Were they concerned about climate change? Now, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I do believe that the farming side of it was in the late 30%. So there was 36, 38% of farmers believe that climate change is actually happening, and that number is a lot higher than I thought it would have been, based on just my own gut instinct and from talking to people.
Okay, was there a difference between that and the level of the general public belief on it?
It was a little bit lower. The general public tend to sort of go along with the climate change argument. I'm not sure why, but certainly it was more like 40%, 40-something% of those who responded believed that there was definitely a climate change happening, and they were concerned about it. And the farming number did surprise me. I thought it would be lower. I felt that it was something that a lot of farmers perhaps believe that they could manage themselves. That if we are seeing more storms, they'll be fine. But clearly, the poll shows there is a bit of concern out there at what it could mean.
Okay, I wonder what do you think the poll would say if we asked a question like, is climate change caused by human activity?
Yeah, I think you'd get more polarisation. I think that you'd have less support for that. And not because people don't believe it, but because there's no real evidence. Like, we've seen Al Gore's movie, we've seen some data that's come out from scientists around the world. There's been a lot of controversy. Certainly that's been fueled by climate change deniers who muddied it up so much now that the only things that we do here are the extreme sides of both
I've got to
arguments.
say, I have difficulty in wondering how the Ice Age occurred.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, obviously there was a big climate change.
Well, it was, yes.
And we weren't burning carbon,
No.
and we weren't doing the things that we're doing today, and we're told are causing a climate change
I think the concern now is the speed that it's changing. But the problem with it is that there's such a small amount of data really that supports what the scientists are saying. Now, as a general public, our poll is actually pointless because all that sort of does is tell us, for politicians and for perhaps the more political side of the science, where they need to focus their energy on. But really, at the end of the day, I think we actually have to have faith in our scientific community that what they are saying is accurate. But the problem with that is, how do we know what they're saying is true? That they believe it. They absolutely believe it.
Well, if we tell them what the public thinks about what they're thinking, then perhaps they'll be more scrupulous in their science.
Possibly.
Okay, so what do you think would happen if we asked people, could climate change be managed by change in human activity?
I think my feeling on that one is that, again, there'd be fairly low support for it. And the reason why, especially in this economic environment, no one wants to spend money, not even if it's for a good thing. And in fact, I wrote a column about this in the Herald the other day. I basically said a bad economy, I think, equals a bad environment. And what I meant by that was that I think that when we had a lot of money, back in the last decade, a lot of money, finance is doing very, very well, the economy was doing well, everyone was talking about climate change. It was a great thing for politics. In fact, in the last US election, it was all they talked about. In this US election, no one cares about the environment. It's all about the economy.
Yeah, well, I think it's about jobs.
Yeah, and
jobs,
I think that fad, if you like, of climate change is probably over until the economy sorts itself out.
Okay, so there's two good questions anyway. I wonder, can we put those into the poll just to see how people do feel about them?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, to the real point, what you should know. Mm-hmm. How does the long-run weather data for New Zealand stack up in terms of demonstrating climate change?
Well, the problem with New Zealand is the short-term history of a lot of our weather stations. We've got weather stations in some cases that have only been around for 30 years, and some of those have been used. The problem that seems to come up over and over again with the climate change skeptics is the fact that the data that is used does not go back far enough. Even 100 years isn't enough. I mean, the climate change cycles sometimes go on thousands of years. And I was watching a documentary on Discovery Channel the other day that said there have been ice ages that have formed within 12 months.
One of the things we do understand is that we're having a hell of a spring.
Yes.
It's up and down like a yo-yo.
Which is normal, though. I mean, that's what spring is about.
Yeah,
spring
I know. You told me
thunderstorms
this. Yeah.
It's a mixture of summer and winter.
The clash of the competing forces in climate. However, I see that La Nina is back. What's that going to mean for us?
Well, look, I think La Nina is not a bad thing for New Zealand. It's good for holidaymakers. They get hot sun, they get plenty of time at the beach with good weather.
Let me just pause for a second and get a very clear explanation of La Nina, because if you look it up, it says it's colder than average surface ocean temperatures. But that's not quite right for us, is it?
No, basically what it is, La Nina overall, because this is the whole Pacific, like El Nino and La Nina are Pacific only.
Yeah.
So when you have La Nina, it means that the winds have blown all the warm water that's over the equator, blows it westwards towards New Zealand and Australia and Fiji and New Caledonia. With El Nino, it goes the other way past the international date line. So when it blows our way, our sea surface temperatures warm up, all that warm water being blown around New Zealand and Australia.
Okay.
But that means it cools
equals
for
rain,
the rest of the
equals
equator.
thunders,
And
equals...
it does. It makes more storms, it makes more thunder. And the weather we're getting right now in New Zealand, this is exactly what we can get from La Nina.
Now tell me, why did the American scientists tell us that La Nina was back before we heard from our New Zealand sources?
Well, basically, each country has their own different group of scientists. We've got NIWA in New Zealand, we've got BOM in Australia, we've got NOAA in America. Now, when I spoke to NIWA about it a couple of weeks ago, because NOAA in America first said La Nina was back around about September the 8th. NIWA just said it last week. But the scientists at NIWA were saying, well, look, there's actually no one switch. It doesn't just sort of flick on overnight. Now we've got La Nina. There are different tests, and everyone has a different way of measuring it. And you can also have La Nina bubbling up in one area, but not everywhere. So it's not an easy thing to understand. And I guess have to take their word for it that they're all on the same page.
All I can say is no wonder it's a hell of a spring.
Yeah, exactly.
Philip Duncan, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Philip Duncan, our weather analyst. And that's all for now. Remember, you can catch our show again anytime via the internet at www.country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson for Tower Sector Report. Till next time, goodbye.
Sector Report was proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.